mais um encontro do Tiaços. Uma sexta-feira chuvosa, friorenta. Está muito frio, Malena? Aqui no Rio de Janeiro também. E hoje a gente vai ter o grande prazer de receber Michael Caplan para falar aqui para nós. Seja bem-vindo, Michael. Grande prazer em te receber. O Michael tem uma trajetória muito particular dentro do campo das ideias, tanto do Hillman como do Giegerich. Eu queria apresentá-lo de uma maneira mais formal, por assim dizer. O Michael tem envolvimento com as ideias de Hillman e de Giegerich desde os anos 90, 1990. E ele apresentou em cada encontro da Sociedade Internacional de Psicologia como a disciplina da interioridade, desde a primeira conferência em 2012. Michael sempre apresentou trabalhos nessas conferências da ISPDI. Seu próximo ensaio, Você Está Aqui, A Lógica da Alma, de acordo com Wolfgang Giegerich e Hillman, aparecerá no próximo livro Psicologia como a disciplina da interioridade, A Vida Lógica da Alma, na obra de Wolfgang Giegerich. O Michael, além de tudo, possui uma produtora chamada House of Shake, que depois o Michael vai botar o site aqui no chat. Michael, por favor, se você puder botar, vai ser ótimo. E o Michael possui também uma experiência em teatro, performance, design de publicação, vários livros junguianos, Psique e Alma, algumas capas da Spring Journal. E o Michael também canta música caseira, né? Inclusive cantou na festa de 80 anos do James Hillman, na Filadélfia, em 2008. Michael, é um prazer te receber, né? É importante localizar um pouco o nosso convite a você. Hillman e Giegerich são duas influências importantes para nós do Tiaços. Particularmente o Hillman, que durante décadas nós temos estudado a obra dele ao longo de muitos e muitos anos, e também o Giegerich mais recentemente, nem tão recentemente assim, mas já há algum tempo. Nós tivemos a grande oportunidade de trazer o Giegerich para falar aqui no Tiaços, na época do lançamento do livro A Vida Lógica da Alma, em português, cujo tradutor, nosso amigo André Dantas, também está aqui presente, e o André daqui a pouco ele fala um pouquinho. Então, é importante marcar que o Tiaços ele é fortemente influenciado pelas ideias do Hillman. Estiveram aqui Michael Van Adams, Stanton Marlan, Edward Cayce, Patrícia Berry, que está aqui hoje para te prestigiar, Michael Cipiora, entre vários outros, Ginette Paris, e também tiveram aqui para nos apresentar e desenvolver melhor as ideias do Giegerich, pessoas muito interessantes, Jennifer Sandoval, Marco Heleno Barreto, Michael Wan, e agora chegou a sua vez. É um grande prazer te receber, Michael, uma grande alegria. Por favor, sinta-se à vontade conosco. Obrigado pela sua presença.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a wonderful introduction and a little overwhelming to be in that company, but welcome to my house. This is my production company, comes from my house, House of Shake, Michael Caplan's House of Shake. Multimedia production company. We published one book at the end of 2017 called A Handbook for Ecstatic Survival by great Canadian choreographer David Earle. And we have a number of other books and projects and things in the works. I put the website up if anybody wants to visit. Always under construction. Now I'm going to share my screen. And I think I'll just launch right into it. That's probably the easiest thing to do. There's a little tiny bit more background first that, and I write about this, the essay "You Are Here" that I have in the upcoming book about Giegerich talks about the personal side of this more, but I came to psychology in general for personal reasons. I had a kind of dramatic teenage breakdown with depersonalization and things like that. And I kind of resolved that at the time, but never resolved many of the underlying questions about the relationship of body and soul, to put it bluntly. And when I, maybe 10 years later, when I came to Hillman, this approach of psychology seemed to me to overarch that divide and allowed me to start thinking about the relationship of, again, to put it starkly, body and soul. It allowed me to think about that in a different way. And I, as I'll say in the presentation, I came across Giegerich very, very shortly after first reading Hillman and having my world sort of turned upside down by Hillman. And the effect on me at the time was that it was like I had gone 9/10 of the way around, and I read Giegerich and he gave me this push, and it sent the whole thing not just upside down, but as I say in the essay, in motion. So, and that was 1991. I was fortunate to attend the Festival of Archetypal Psychology in Notre Dame, as the Americans say. And it's just been an ongoing fascination ever since. I presented, as Marcus said, at the conferences, the ISPDI conferences, and written some essays in the newsletter. So what I'm going to read to you now comes partially from things that I've written before in the newsletter, partially from the essay in the upcoming book, and then some specific things for today's presentation. So I will launch into it. I hope you find it interesting. And I will share my screen. There we are. Hillman, Giegerich, and the completion of the psychological move. I would first like to thank Marcus Conteas for the invitation to address the ASOS. I'm honored, which is an understatement, and delighted, especially so because I'm not a psychologist or an academic. But I have a 30-year fascination with the trajectory in which James Hillman and Wolfgang Giegerich have taken psychological thinking, building upon Jung's insight about psychology's uniqueness as an interpretive approach and explanatory model. That is, its lack of an Archimedean point. Am I going, is this pace okay? Is this okay? Yeah. Okay. This Euroboric closure of interpretation I call the completion of the psychological move. By means of this move, as a consequence of this methodological decision to interiorize, as Giegerich would say, every phenomenon into itself, the psyche is reinstated in its hereditary rank as that which surrounds us on all sides and has nothing outside of itself. It is thanks to this absolutely phenomenological methodology that we may access that dimension of sense, logos of psyche, organizing and animating our real-world lives from within. This presentation incorporates material from two other essays, Revolt or Revolution, Hillman, Giegerich, and the Completion of the Psychological Move, published in the August 2013 issue of the ISPDI newsletter, and You Are Here, Psyche's Logic, according to Wolfgang Giegerich and James Hillman, in Dusk Owl Books' forthcoming Psychology as the Discipline of Interiority, the Soul's Logical Life in the work of Wolfgang Giegerich. So this is from an unpublished piece by Giegerich that he gave me permission to quote this epigraph. So, At a time when spraying graffiti was still unknown in Europe, there all of a sudden appeared in Zurich someone who soon became known as the Zurich Sprayer. In a spontaneous reaction, Hillman, with his martial, somewhat youthful anti-authority bent, found this great, because the sprayer put a face on naked blank walls. This was, for me, a very revealing response, because it is anti-phenomenological. Putting something on a blank surface to give it a face versus letting the phenomena show their actual face or non-face. Here, letting precisely the emptiness and barrenness of a concrete wall speak. One revolution. I've often described my 1991 encounter with the work of James Hillman and Wolfgang Giegerich as occasioning a revolution, though it came in two parts. I read Hillman first. Key texts like Myth of Analysis and Revisioning Psychology plunged me into an unprecedented underworld sort of awareness, a sense of intellectual disorientation and shadowy aliveness that was at times physically dizzying. Going through every back issue of Spring Journal in Toronto's York University Library, however, I quickly discovered Giegerich's essays on phenomena even more disquieting than Hillman's readings of suicide, betrayal, or war. And I found myself sympathetic to Giegerich's criticisms of Hillman, as well as open to his charge that Hillman's move remained somehow incomplete. With my critique, wrote Giegerich, I mobilized Hillman against Hillman. It is not enough to say, as Hillman's revisioning does, that we ought to look with an archetypal eye rather than at archetypes. This is still too vague and undisciplined, lending itself too readily to the sort of woolliness Hillman had challenged in the thinking of conventional Jungians. And it was coming from someone who had indeed brilliantly analyzed and celebrated a host of archetypal configurations. The radicality of Hillman's dehumanizing remains incommensurable with every personalistic psychology, yet it's still not enough to say, as Hillman did, I think they, conventional psychologists, see the images as belonging to the patient, and I see the patient as belonging to the images. It's not enough to say that if one's focus remains so resolutely on individual personal human experience. Especially when one has broached the notion of an anima mundi, a soul of the world. An imagination of extraversion that would interpret our manufactured environment psychologically is potentially revolutionary, yet what remains when one turns so decisively from modernity's nihilistic phenomenology in an effort to play match games with the riches of a wholly different world, such as ancient Greece? Giegerich's essays on the atomic bomb especially seem to me to go all the way into modernity's presenting problems and to give my own thinking a push that could take it all the way around, that is, all the way into motion. For I believe it's not just a matter of perspective turned upside down, of seeing the day world from the underworld and so on, but of an incessant conceptual activity like gyroscopic in-flight adjustments orienting us toward that center of gravity of meaning we know as truth. Divergence. Giegerich has said of Hillman's work that it has no peers among the other types of psychology in the Jungian tradition, for in Hillman, psychology became conscious of itself. For his part, Hillman had called Giegerich's the most important Jungian thought now going on, maybe the only consistent Jungian thought at all. He stares into the face of the shadow in our times and offers no false hopes. Hillman's praise, however, came in an essay entitled Once More Into the Fray, which rejected criticisms leveled by Giegerich in Killings, Psychology's Platonism and the Missing Link to Reality during the Festival of Archetypal Psychology in 1991, which I was fortunate to attend. This signaled the start of what Hillman called a divergence that was never settled by either party. Neither was it, to my mind, resolved by others who later tried to pose the question as Hillman's preference for anima over Giegerich's animus, nor of the conflict between generalized abstractions like image versus concept, imagination versus logic. These opposing terms do certainly inform and color their writings. Hillman's favored locution was, after all, imagination, whereas Giegerich has written that the realm of psychology begins where the imagination has been superseded. And Hillman did title a book Anima, the anatomy of a personified notion, while Giegerich wrote Animus Psychologie. For me, the insights of one rarely come to mind without the reminders and correctives of the other. To take the paradigmatic example of dream interpretation, that what we are after is the dream's own inherent logic, which is hardly of a rationalistic sort, should be enough to recall us to the right sort of dialectical understanding of such oppositional language. Yet Giegerich felt compelled to conclude, excuse me, that Hillman's conception of soul is unctuous and mystifying, that Hillman had settled for a nostalgic romantic position. He demonstrated that some of Hillman's most treasured propositions, for example, his celebration of an aesthetic animal sense as a legitimate response to modernity, and his insufficiently considered anima mundi, functioned as avoidance strategies, signaling Hillman's own failure to stare into the face of the shadow in our times. Ouroboros. Jung identified the singularity of psychology. Every other science has a point outside of itself. Not so psychology, whose object is the very subject that produces all science. Psyche is, as Giegerich paraphrases, not only the object, but also the subject, the absolute condition of consciousness itself. Endorsing Hillman's reformulation on this very basis, he explained that, quote, revisioning psychology was an attempt to construe psychology as one integral whole. All the particular ideas of this psychology were rooted in and derived from one center or ground, the notion of soul. If there is, for every other science, only one scientific method, empirical and experimental, so their contrary, the unique science of psychology, is not such that there could be several varieties of it. And I'm just going to underline that phrase from Giegerich because it's so important in my thinking about this. Psychology is not such that there could be several varieties of it. Thus, Giegerich's, quote, concern is about the particular direction in which a psychological investigation would have to move in order to become psychological in the first place. A psychology that would deserve its name, one claiming to speak for psyche, would entail a logos capable of moving in a particular direction in order for it to be a true psychology, a psychology with soul, that is, psychology as the discipline of interiority. It must be Euroboric. Yet at the same time, we are dealing with phenomena, with precisely that which appears to us. The supposed teeming imagination, wrote Hillman, is limited to its phenomenal appearance in a particular image, that specific one which has come to me pregnant with significance and intention, a necessary angel as it appears here and now, and which teaches the hand to represent it, the ear to hear, and the heart how to respond. And he relentlessly called out our evasions. We would each escape the necessity of the image, whether it be dreams, fantasies, or the images in which we find ourselves behaving. He did so because a true psychology, a psychology with soul, attests that in my disturbances, there really are forces I cannot control, yet which want something from me and intend something with me. Therefore, as Giegerich counsels, what matters therapeutically is not how to get out of a distressing situation, but on the contrary, how to get properly into it. One. So to return to our opening, here is James staring at the blank wall in Zurich, and Wolfgang critical of his friend's anti-phenomenological, unpsychological impulse to change what he sees before him. Personally, preferentially, we might second Hillman's urge. But Hillman is not a graffiti artist, he's a psychologist. Moreover, a rare and powerful advocate for a psychology that would deserve its name. One expressly aiming, in Hillman's own words, to restore to psyche and psychology its ancient sense akin to soul. Such an ancient sense is that of psyche as that which surrounds us on all sides and has nothing outside of itself. Here is the crux of Giegerich's challenge. Hillman should have known better than to propose corrective responses, moralistic, activist, aesthetic, to the world's presenting problems. In contrast, Giegerich, accepting the facts of our case, that the only thing that really counts is what our real behavior thinks, instructs us, therefore, to unconditionally humble ourselves before the relentless truth of that which has really presented itself, prior to any condemning or condoning, and prior to any wish to change or improve anything. When Hillman once said to Giegerich that time was psychologically of no interest to him, he revealed his own blind spot, one that provided him with an escape route from the necessity of the image, that cut him off from the completion of the psychological move, that prevented him from achieving a full revolution. For as Giegerich reminds us, appropriating Hillman's own term, soul making is not free, ad lib. It has no choice. It is committed to and bound by our specific inness in our historical locus, in the truth of our real situation. How can our necessary angel appear if we avert our gaze from the here and now? Real. A personal anecdote from decades ago emerges as emblematic of a pivotal dispute about a practice whose very nature dictates that it is not such that there could be several varieties of it. Hillman's natural impulse here was simply wrong for a psychology with soul. He himself had said that an image tells you where you are, not what to do, or by placing you where you are, it tells you what you are doing. So he knew, as Giegerich puts it, that we must let ourselves be placed by the soul's process into the situation that is. Psychology leads us back to our concrete time-bound world, but initiated into an awareness that the outside was always already inside, right here where we find ourselves, right where I come to be. The I and the necessary angel that faces me, our very subjectivity and the phenomena we encounter are mutually defining. This initiation does not make us whole, writes Hillman. Rather, it makes us aware of always being in a dance, always a reflection of an invisible other. So in a true psychology, what is coming is not viewed as enemy, senseless, and utterly alien, totally unrelated. Although as yet unknown, it is nevertheless a priori connected to us. There is an intrinsic bond between what is coming and us. It belongs. It has a right to come. For psychology, reality is what appears to us and as us. If Giegerich goes further than Hillman, is there a move beyond Giegerich? It can only be ever and anew into the real, into the here and now. The outline of psychological movement is essentially complete, was indeed already complete with Jung's insight into its Euroboric nature. It requires only the further elaboration of its intricacies, a willingness to accept its revolutionary implications, and the courage to stick to the phenomenon. And now I'm just going to read the coda that I wrote today. It may be ever so slightly different from what you have. Coda on Hillman, Giegerich, and time. Giegerich precisely explains why the acknowledgement of time, of the particular moment, is indispensable for psychological thinking. The awareness in psychology of time as something essential to reckon with is, as it were, the placeholder or representation within the theoretical framework of psychology, or within the logical form of psychological consciousness, of the idea of the objective psyche. Hillman became blind before modernity's necessity, before the objective psyche, which by temperament, it seems, he simply could not face. That he does in certain places, particularly in his extraordinary Eranos paper, The Imagination of Air and the Collapse of Alchemy, only intensifies the inexcusability of his betrayal of this insight elsewhere. In Divergences, Hillman admits, therefore Wolfgang is justified in claiming that I am nostalgic and escapist from the actual historical present. In this bald pronouncement is captured, I believe, the very core of Hillman's capitulation, the restriction of his otherwise brilliant radicalism to mere revolt, his pulling back before real revolution. Hegel had complained about those thinkers of his own era who are not able to overcome their aversion to actuality, and who, in their sadness for the collapse of their ideals, become tedious and peevish about the condition of the world. Hillman's trademark psychological moves, so determinedly homeopathic elsewhere, how many times do we read that like cures like, becomes allopathic when dealing with actuality, and therefore unpsychological. It took Giegerich's diligence to address the situation of modernity, of contemporary life itself. It is less glamorous than dwelling amidst the ancient gods, but Giegerich has truly wrestled with the facts of the case, with our actual presenting problems: bomb, media, meaninglessness, rockets, television. Hillman's approach to modernity was doomed to fail in the consulting room of theoretical analysis because it could not stay with the matter at hand. It must rather keep circumventing it, obsessively placing it into multiplicity, relativization as defense mechanism. Once one understands something of the true sense of the polytheistic God image in its multiplicity, and once one has grasped the theoretical function of such understanding, one must discern and address the particular God, which has come to us pregnant with significance and intention, as Hillman had said. Yet Hillman abandons psychological thinking just where it's needed most, in the face of the presenting problem. And the failure of his theory presents its complicity with, its instantiation of the neurosis of modernity itself. Giegerich breaks through the neurosis by allowing us to confront what our necessary angel brings, the absolute authority of the dissolution of authority. Paradoxical as it may sound, and contra Hillman, this insight is the singular truth of an only apparently pluralistic age.
Obrigado, Michael. Obrigado. Bom, várias questões para a gente poder trabalhar. Michael, eu queria fazer, antes da gente abrir para a pergunta, eu queria fazer somente um registro que eu acho importante, histórico. O Michael usa no texto dele uma carta do Hillman chamada Divergências. É importante para a gente marcar aqui que, em 2008, o André Dantas, que está aqui, que traduziu A Vida Lógica da Alma, eu e o Joel Brinco do Nascimento, a gente, em São Paulo, nós fizemos um seminário chamado Psicologia Arquetípica, Hillman e Giegerich, diferenças e aproximações. André, me lembra depois o título, se é esse ou não. E nós pedimos para o Hillman e para o Giegerich se eles queriam mandar algum depoimento sobre esse evento, e, surpreendentemente para nós, ambos mandaram. E parece que é a primeira vez que o Hillman tinha se debruçado sobre, de maneira um pouco mais extensa, né, a responder às críticas do Giegerich. Esse material não foi publicado. Então, só para deixar claro esse momento histórico, essas cartas estão traduzidas para o português, elas estão num site chamado Travessia do Rubicão, que é um site que eu tinha com o amigo Henrique Pereira, e é um belo material de pesquisa, tá? Então, fica só como uma referência histórica. Michael, queria começar levantando uma questão para você que sempre me vem à cabeça quando essa polêmica Hillman e Giegerich surge, que é a questão da história, né? Lá no Divergências, o Hillman diz assim: Giegerich me acusa de nostálgico e escapista. E é curioso que o Hillman fala, é uma acusação justificada e pertinente. Sim, é isso mesmo, ele está certo. Só que o Hillman vai adiante e diz, eu não sou apenas um romântico, mas eu sou um classicista. Eu olho para trás para imaginar a história. Né? E aí ele abre uma perspectiva que é se essa perspectiva histórica que o Giegerich tem, que é uma perspectiva que ele nomeia como positivista, né? Literalista, esse determinismo temporal, se isso, na verdade, eles estão falando, a minha pergunta para você é isso, Michael, eles estão falando do mesmo lugar? Aonde o Giegerich acusa o Hillman de nostálgico, romântico, aonde o Hillman diz que o Giegerich faz um uso positivista da história. Onde é que a gente se encontra nisso? Qual é a tua opinião sobre isso? Onde é que se localiza o cerne desse debate? Queria ouvir a tua opinião sobre.
I'm glad you asked. First, because my fantasy was always to sit with Hillman and Giegerich in a room and go, you're saying the same things. You're just not seeing this, and you're just, you know. I think, you know, Hillman's responses to Giegerich to me never seem, this is what was disappointing. They never seem to hit the mark. It's like saying you shouldn't take your patient's life situation into account, that you're being positivistic by taking the facts of the case into account, but you don't have anything else. Of course, you have to take history now history gets more complicated, of course, because it's cultural and there's much more to debate about and all that. But essentially, to me, although I'm not a psychologist, the consulting room has always seemed the model for psychological theorizing about anything else. And so in the consulting room, if the patient is, you know, Western culture or our historical moment, then we need the facts of the case. That's not positivism. That is where Hillman makes this slippery move out of the necessity of the image.
Você acha que eles falam de perspectivas completamente diferentes? Quer dizer, eu concordo contigo que o Hillman ele não responde às proposições ou provocações do Giegerich. Você acha que eles estão falando de perspectivas muito distantes ou não?
It goes back to the question, really, of psychology is not such that there could be several varieties of it. So if they are diverging here, in a sense, someone has to be right and someone has to be wrong. And on this question, to me, Hillman is just wrong. From a psychological point of view, his response is not legitimate, because it evades what he himself said is the necessity of the image that has come to me pregnant with significance and intention. So the original story of the two of them in Zurich and the gray wall, and you know, you could say it's really nothing. Of course, why shouldn't Hillman want to spray paint something on the wall? Why shouldn't anyone respond to a blank wall that way? But Giegerich, in this insignificant example, is discerning something he feels is an unpsychological, anti-phenomenological move on Hillman's part. and then seeing that same thing appearing in other places. And I think Hillman genuinely, emotionally, humanly, in a way, was overwhelmed by modernity and by the destructiveness of modernity, and almost was like a psychologist who's overwhelmed by the material his patient brings him, but doesn't know how to gain any purchase, gain a hold on it. This is my feeling. That's my kind of gut feeling about it. And I think that theoretically, you can make the case, if we stay with Jung's fundamental insight about the Euroboric nature of psychology, you can make a case that psychology is not such that there can be varieties of it. So archetypal psychology versus psychology as the discipline of interiority, to me, is just, I have no interest in those names, or in comparing two schools or something like that. I would rather say, what is psychology, and how does archetypal psychology contribute to that, and how does what some people unfortunately call PDI, psychology as the discipline of interiority, how does that influence or inform psychology qua psychology? And I think in interior, just a tangent on psychology as the discipline of interiority, the reason I've never felt comfortable with that name, first because it gives a qualifying name to something that really should just be called psychology, although we don't perhaps have the arrogance or the confidence to make that statement. That is really what we should be doing. It's also the discipline, not of interiority, but of interiorization. It's the discipline, it's a process. It's not a place we get to, interiority. We work by interiorizing. That's the key, and that's to me why the name PDI, what some people call Giegerich psychology, to me is misleading. I mean, it points in the right direction, but it points at an object instead of an activity, or a domain, a place, instead of an action.
Ótimo. Obrigado, Michael. Pessoal, abertas perguntas, tá? Quem quiser perguntar, coloca o nome no chat, eu chamo e a pessoa, por favor, faça a pergunta. Luciana, contigo, por favor.
Obrigada, Michael, pela sua palestra.
Thank you.
Foi ótimo te ouvir.
Thank you.
Eu tenho uma pergunta. Antes de fazer a pergunta, eu queria fazer... Bom, primeiro eu quero dizer que eu sou uma estudiosa, uma admiradora, uma defensora, uma fã do Hillman. Então, é muito difícil eu ouvir as críticas do Giegerich para ele. Então, a partir daí, eu queria falar duas coisas. Uma é assim, eu sou muito clínica, né? Mesmo nas coisas que eu escrevo e tal, sempre tenho como pano de fundo e como cenário a minha experiência clínica. E quando eu encontrei o Hillman, deu uma diferença enorme na minha clínica. Foi onde eu me encontrei na clínica, na prática. Né? Então, eu queria só comentar isso, que tem uma fala de que o Hillman é muito teórico e pouco usual na clínica, que eu tenho um depoimento pessoal muito contrário disso. Né? Essa é uma coisa. A outra coisa que eu queria que você comentasse é... O Giegerich fala que que o Hillman propõe respostas corretivas, moralistas, ativistas e estéticas. Eu não consigo ver muito isso na obra do Hillman. A estética e ativista, sim, mas resposta já é uma coisa que o Hillman não costuma dar. Corretiva e moralista, para mim, é muito difícil de encontrar. Eu queria que você comentasse um pouquinho isso, por favor.
Thank you. I understand, absolutely. I don't even know how to say, you know, I love Hillman too, and the same kind of, there's this personal connection that I think people have with these people and with this work that's really quite remarkable. And that doesn't lead to kind of cultish, thinking, unlike so many other, maybe I'm just in the cult and I don't see it, right? But I found in people who read Hillman and Giegerich, there's a tremendous good faith wrestling with real questions. And I think that's why it's been so appealing to non-psychologists, to laymen like me and many, many, many other people who get involved with it, because we are interested in these questions. And here is, informed people really wrestling with these questions. So I understand where you're coming from. And Hillman is, it's always this question, like Giegerich talks about Jung. He makes these very pointed, very brutal criticisms of Jung in some places, where he says Jung falls back behind his own level of insight. And I think the same thing basically happens with Hillman. I think he understands these things on a certain really fundamental level. But when it gets to certain questions, certain issues, he just can't apply it. He can't go there. And maybe everyone is like that. I have issues, like I said, with some of Giegerich's readings of certain phenomena, Islamic terrorism, various things, even God. I disagree in certain very precise ways. And Giegerich has not acknowledged or agreed with my criticisms. Perhaps I'm wrong, whatever. But so it's partly just the nature of these things. I think that this disagreement is archetypal, if you will. We're not going to get rid of it. But his moralism shows up to me, well, in this example, of course, it depends how much weight you want to give to this example, but Giegerich is pointing out that Hillman's response is aesthetic. Let me make this look better, this blank concrete wall. In terms of moralism, to me, the most severe criticism I can make about Hillman is his moralism about monotheism. In a way, his frequent, not just criticism, but sort of demeaning of monotheism and of the meaning of monotheism and of the structure of monotheism. And I say this as someone who is not technically a monotheist. I'm not a believer particularly in any one thing, but I'm fascinated by this whole phenomenon of monotheism. And so while Hillman's, what did he call it? Running engagement with Christianity. In interviews, he called it the running engagement with Christianity. While that was very helpful for me at the time, because it allowed me to think about Christianity, to think about all the religions polytheistically as having a certain place, having a certain meaning, which allowed me to relativize monotheism itself. Giegerich has a phrase somewhere that the God of the absolute isn't necessarily the absolute God, just because that's what he quote unquote calls himself, or how that God appears phenomenologically, doesn't mean that it is the absolute. Won't get into that, but basically it's around that phenomenon that I found Hillman moralistic, and ultimately found, although it was useful at the time, found his position on Christianity couldn't grasp what Giegerich was trying to say about Christianity, which admittedly is very, very challenging. The idea that Christianity has essentially become technology, that technology is the fulfillment of Christianity. That's very hard to wrap your mind around, but I was convinced by that as at least a relevant, true dimension of monotheism.
Obrigada.
Obrigado, Lu. André, com você. Michael, André Dantas, que vai perguntar agora, é que foi o tradutor do Vida Lógica da Alma essa tarefa simples, fácil e prazerosa para o
Okay,
português.
let me just
André, meu amigo, contigo.
Olá, Michael. Foi uma...
I'm trying to see if I can find you. Oh, there you are. Okay, good. Okay.
Muito bom, né? A sua fala, muito contundente, né? Assim, muito direto, né? Assim, em relação deixa muito claro quais são as posições do Giegerich e as posições do Hillman, onde eles divergem, né? Onde eles se encontram e onde eles começam a seguir caminhos diferentes, né? Assim, de uma clareza, assim, enorme, que ajuda muito, né? No grupo da gente que estuda a obra do Giegerich aqui no Brasil. Mas eu queria te fazer uma pergunta, né? Que é uma questão para mim, né? Que enfim, desde que eu comecei a ler o Giegerich, eu nunca não consegui ainda encontrar se é uma contradição na minha cabeça ou se é uma contradição na obra dele mesmo, né? Que é um trechozinho aqui do Psicologia Analítica e Dialética, no pós-fácil, né, que ele vai falar sobre o prefácio do David Miller, aqui na página 108, né? Que ele, de repente, está falando aqui do prefácio do David Miller e ele manda essa, né? Olha aqui o trecho que interessa, né? Está no parágrafo, no finalzinho do parágrafo. Posições psicológicas não são completamente acessíveis a argumentações, visto que elas expressam interesses pessoais investidos. Aí ele continua. A psicologia que alguém tem, a psicologia que alguém é, a psicologia que alguém vive. Ele está falando aqui da equação pessoal do Jung, né? Porque né, como é que esse trecho dele, né, que ele está falando da psicologia que alguém é, a psicologia que alguém vive, que isso não é acessível completamente à argumentação, como é que isso combina, né, com esse trecho aqui que você falou muito bem, né, que a psicologia não é tal que possa haver várias variedades dela. Porque né, se há essa psicologia que alguém vive, que não é completamente acessível à argumentação, como é que combina isso, essas duas coisas, né?
I love these absolutely extreme contradictions that make me go, I have no idea. That's so interesting. I don't know. It kind of relates to the question of whether there's an objective or a shareable meaning that we can agree on about something. First off, I guess every phenomenon, every real phenomenon is so complex and multi-sided that in order for its sides to be expressed, it will need people to express them. And those opinions will appear contradictory or divergent, or they are divergent. But somehow they're both oriented toward and expressing something about the same phenomenon. In the unpublished piece that Giegerich wrote about Hillman, that I quoted some sections of, he gives an example of him and Hillman in exactly this way, and he talks about the two of them as expressing two sides, or two perhaps of many sides, but two sides of a certain phenomenon. They have to come out, they have to take a form, and so inevitably there's going to be contradiction between people's perspectives on that phenomenon. I suppose the challenge to psychology, such that there are not several varieties of it, would be to understand and sublate, to use the Hegelian word, but to understand, to comprehend what's being expressed in that contradiction itself. So what's the larger reality that's made up of these contradictory, seemingly contradictory or functionally contradictory positions? I once had a thought about the idea that let's agree to disagree. And rather than that being a some kind of a giving up, some kind of a oh, well, let's just agree to disagree. Never mind, forget it. Rather than that, if we understood agreement to disagree as necessary to the phenomenon itself in order to express its contradictory sides. So there won't be anything without disagreement. And those disagreements have more or less relevance to the thing that we're trying to talk about, which doesn't actually really exist except in our talking about it. So this is why talking about it and trying to define it is so important, because these are phenomena of meaning, and they only exist if we articulate them precisely. They only function if we articulate them precisely. Does that make?
É uma questão aqui que que é difícil, né? Enfim, o Giegerich ele tem algumas contradições que eu vejo na obra dele, que eu fico na dúvida se são contradições na minha cabeça ou se são contradições da própria Caminhos, né? Que ele vai seguindo, porque se isso caminhasse para o lado de uma equação pessoal, né? Estou falando quando eu leio, né? Então, na verdade, a interiorização na imagem, né? Não é a interiorização da imagem nela mesma, mas a interiorização de um encontro, né? De uma psicologia pessoal com o fenômeno. Né? Você não tem uma psicologia, vamos dizer assim, objetiva, né? No sentido que o Giegerich coloca, mas uma psicologia onde há um encontro aí de uma posição psicológica com um fenômeno. Uma posição psicológica poderia ser falado nos termos indianos de atuação pessoal, porque aí chegaria no ponto onde, no debate que ele teve até com Mark Saban, onde ele coloca que nem todo mundo, a psicologia como disciplina da interioridade não é para todos, né? Algumas pessoas sentem o chamado, outras pessoas não, e tudo bem, né? Vida que segue, né, de uma certa maneira, né? E fiquei em dúvida se essa questão, né, isso que ele fala aqui tem a ver com esse chamado, né? Alguma coisa que, quando você lê a obra dele, você sente esse chamado que toca esse aspecto, né? Que poderia, nos termos junguianos, né, clássicos, ser chamado de psicologia, de equação pessoal. Né? Não sei se ficou claro.
I don't know if this addresses this, but in the encounter, the meaning, the sense is something that exists. It's not created in the person, and it's not given by the thing. It's created by that interaction, like you said. Mm-hmm. So the psychological response would be somehow to understand what that overarching unity is that creates the meaning in that phenomenon for that person, and that person's attraction to or involvement with that phenomenon. The meaning as being the thing that exists that unifies them, despite their difference. And I don't know, on the one hand, Giegerich often says things like this, if you don't want to do it, if it's not your cup of tea, you won't do it. And so he's being very pragmatic in that sense and saying, just like Hillman, like anything, nothing is going to appeal to everyone. But I think he is still trying to articulate a a meaning of phenomena that would be shared. So when he articulates the meaning of a cultural phenomenon like technology, and at one point concludes the nuclear bomb is God, he wants you to agree with that. Essentially, he wants you to see the logic in the phenomenon, and to say, yes, we are both involved with this same phenomenon, and our personal preferences or what have you are essentially irrelevant to this larger phenomenon. So I don't know, how to make sense, because my background is not in Jung, but started directly with Hillman, and I've never quite known what to make of the personal equation beyond the obvious. Everybody sees things from their own point of view, and there's only so much you can do to overcome that or to address that. But I don't know what else to think about it beyond that.
Tem umas coisas aqui para pensar sobre, né? Ok, grávido, pensando.
Obrigado, André. Bom te ver. Gustavo, por favor.
I wonder too, just before, I wonder too, if we take a phenomenon like time and look at Hillman's response and Giegerich's response to it, and in their difference, find not just a personal difference of how they're looking at this phenomenon, but in how the phenomenon itself appears in the world. It appears with, this kind of willingness to embrace the present, this determined kind of quality of being, I'm going to face the present. But in order to face the present, we also need these, or we may also need these things from the past that we hold to. So the value of someone holding to that, even if it cuts them off from a certain perspective about the present, may still tell us something about the phenomenon itself, about time and about modernity. That modernity itself rejects our ability to look at it, and that Hillman in a way is embodying, in this one example anyway, is embodying that response, not to Giegerich, but to the phenomenon of modernity. What I liked about Hillman was he always put the focus on that third thing, not the personal thing of you and I, but the third thing that both of us are focused on, that is defined between the two of us.
Bom.
Perfeito. Gustavo, vamos lá?
Olá, boa tarde. Obrigado, Michael, pela sua palestra. Foi ótimo, foi bem interessante para mim, que estou começando a entender um pouco os estudos do Giegerich. E por isso mesmo, assim, as minhas perguntas talvez sejam mais perguntas de principiante, assim, mas considero importante, assim, para conseguir entender um pouco melhor isso. Então, eu tenho duas questões, mas vou tentar fazê-las, na verdade, né? Primeiro, né, assim, eu fiquei pensando como é que a gente pode, se e como, né, a gente pode pensar em transdisciplinariedade, que é um princípio muito importante para o Jung, a partir dessa radicalização da perspectiva urobórica. Quer dizer, radicalizando a perspectiva urobórica, né, a partir da noção de interioridade, é possível pensar em transdisciplinariedade? De que modo, né? E isso tem a ver com a minha segunda pergunta, né, que eu queria entender um pouco, assim, né, se a concepção de história traz no pensamento do Giegerich uma dimensão explicativa das imagens, né, ou seja, uma certa dimensão material que informe aquela imagem, né, a partir da história cultural. Você percebe isso, ou isso seria também sair da imagem? Como é que fica essa perspectiva histórico-cultural nessa perspectiva do Giegerich? Obrigado.
I'm not sure Yeah, I'm not sure I understand the second part. So let me just talk about the first part and then come back to the second part. So transdisciplinary, this notion of transdisciplinary. I think personally, I think we're always inevitably going to be transdisciplinary in addressing real world issues, whether that's in our own lives or in a cultural context. So dimensions, for example, of morality or ethics or things like that are going to, and pragmatics, technology, access to technology, all these kinds of questions are going to become real issues that have to be addressed in any real world, dealing with any real world situation, from the consulting room to the, to the civilization. But to me, psychology itself is not transdisciplinary. It stands in such a unique relationship to all other forms of interpretation and of knowledge. And like Jung says that the quote in the paper, in the presentation, it's the subject that produces all science. It's on both sides of the equation. Unlike certainly every other empirical naturalistic science, where the subject is very precisely divided from the object of study. And even in physics, where you have the interaction of the observer and the observed, it's specifically not the personal observer, it's the observer as a function. So the subject-object distinction is maintained in every other science. And in every other interpretative approach, that subject-object distinction is also maintained. So psychology is literally singular. There's no other approach that attempts this challenge of interpreting meaning from within meaning, so to speak. There's nowhere to get outside of the meaning and understand what it means. You have to do that from within meaning. And in a way, that speaks to the personal equation too. The personal equation is a sense of the meaning that you are, as Giegerich would say, the meaning as which you exist is the personal equation. So it's always meaning interacting with meaning. And psychology is the only field that addresses meaning on that level completely. There's nothing but meaning, pure meaning. Giegerich says somewhere, psychological events are events of meaning. That's their very nature as a psychological event. What was I going to say about that? Okay, so in the second part of the question, so that transdisciplinary, right? So I sometimes think of psychologists, those of us who are attempting to really hone in on and define and stay true to psychological thinking, are in a way like the first natural scientists working in alchemical labs amidst all these people trying to produce gold to get rich, and all that there's these empirical scientists who have discovered this subject-object distinction and what can be created, what can be achieved by insisting, no, there's no supernatural explanation, there's no, all we have are objective processes, and we are going to stand outside them and do science, do empirical science. It's the very bedrock requirement of empirical science. And in a weird way, psychology of this type, to me, is like the way those people were at the beginning. We've defined something that even the field of psychology in general doesn't grasp, doesn't wrestle with. And that's the Euroboric nature of psychological interpretation. So I don't know. Now, the second part of the question, I'm not sure what.
Então, assim, acho que pode falar, Isa, não sei se você está me ouvindo. Então, na verdade, nessa segunda parte, acho que você já respondeu um pouco sobre isso, assim, mas tem a ver exatamente com essa dimensão, né, entre o indivíduo e a história cultural como algo que informa alguma coisa sobre a dimensão psicológica, né? Acho que hoje, na psicologia em geral, é, essas perspectivas, né, assim, da cultura em geral, são informadas por outras ciências, como as ciências sociais, e eu percebo que o Giegerich tenta fazer um outro caminho, né, que não passa por aí, ou que diz que até a alma abandonou certos aspectos que hoje as ciências sociais trabalham, como gênero, por exemplo, e aí tem uma noção própria de alma, né, como uma coisa que se move, não sei se paralelamente ao indivíduo, né, mas eu queria entender exatamente isso. Como é que é esse uso, né, da noção de história em termos dessa interioridade, né? Assim, a história é interioridade, né, também, nessa perspectiva?
He certainly, more than anyone, really insists that history is the alchemical vessel through which the soul works upon itself. It's the ground that in which psyche or soul materializes itself in history and works upon itself and changes itself. There's a quote from Hillman, I don't have it offhand, excuse me, in Revisioning Psychology, where he talks about psychologists, whether they can stand for it or not, have to accept that psyche is the first principle, and every other discipline ultimately comes out of psyche, is produced by the psyche, the soul of humans. So psychology can ask about the findings or the topics that interest other disciplines like social sciences or what have you, but it asks, to me, it would ask, why is soul looking at things in this way? Why is soul using social science in order to think about itself? Rather than directly, what are the findings of social science? Although, of course, looking at what's going on culturally, we need all the facts of the case. So the findings of social psychology, the findings of empirical psychology, the findings of the sciences to some degree, but certainly those humans, quote unquote, human sciences, all that is material that goes into the case file. These are things that psychology can then think about, but they are brought into the consulting room. Social science is brought into the consulting room.
Obrigado, acho que é exatamente isso que eu estava tentando entender.
Obrigado, Gustavo. Michael, uma questão para você. Vou retomar da citação. A história é o vaso alquímico onde a alma trabalha sobre si mesma. Nós temos atravessado um momento histórico da mais profunda crise ambiental. Desastres ecológicos, desastres ambientais, escassez dos recursos naturais, correntes migratórias que vão modificar completamente uma espécie de disposição das cidades. Ainda que, num primeiro momento, a Anima Mundi, lá em 82, em Florença...
Você travou. Você travou. Volta um pouquinho a pergunta.
Onde é que eu estava?
Eita, Isa, fala aí qual foi a última coisa que você traduziu.
Desastres ambientais, escassez dos recursos naturais, correntes migratórias que vão mudar disposições geográficas das cidades, enfim, a crise do antropoceno. No meio disso, essa é a história viva atual. Quando o Hillman traz o conceito de anima mundi, em 82, num primeiro momento, ele faz quase um recorte urbano, né, de que a alma não está na natureza, mas a alma também pode ser feita na cidade, cidade e alma. Mas o conceito de anima mundi também é um conceito de resgatar uma perspectiva não humana, né, para além do homem. Né? Como ele diz no Revendo a Psicologia, o de-humanizar. Né? Tudo aquilo que também merece atenção psicológica, que está fora do homem. Né? Retorno do animismo. E aí a gente vê como esse é um tema também presente na filosofia contemporânea, Isabel Stengers, reativando o animismo, enfim. E aí vem o Giegerich e aponta que a anima mundi ela é quase uma espécie de recurso retórico nostálgico pré-moderno. Eu estou me lembrando também aqui do David Tacey, que diz, ao contrário, que a anima mundi seria um conceito pós-cartesiano. Quer dizer, se a história é o vaso alquímico, onde a alma faz o trabalho sobre si mesmo, não te dá a impressão de que, às vezes, o pensamento do Giegerich ele fica restrito a uma certa esfera? Quer dizer, a história está acontecendo, há novos fenômenos acontecendo. E aí a minha pergunta é, o pensamento do Giegerich não chegou lá ainda, nessas dimensões da história, ou o pensamento do Giegerich lê esses fenômenos novos, sempre ele interpreta a visão do Hillman sobre esses fenômenos, sempre como uma espécie de retorno animista encantado a um mundo pré-moderno. Você não acha que tem a palavra não é boa, um reducionismo que o Giegerich opera aqui, que não é interessante? Acho que a pergunta ficou longa, mas... Deu para ir, Isa?
I think it is reductionist, but I think it's also very deliberately reductionist. He's trying to make a point in a way about what I ended with was just sort of the singularity or the idea that the meaning that is addressing us in the contemporary world is a singular one. There's one meaning, and it has to do with the erosion, the dissolution of meaning and of authority. That's in Giegerich's view, that's the only thing that's at work, and it's happening on every level, and it's equalizing every level. So nothing can stand out as archetypally important because everything has been reduced to this horizontal level. The vertical dimension has been excised in modernity. And so he's trying to say, this is what I discern in the phenomenon of modernity. This is the intention I see at work in the phenomenon. So the perhaps impossible psychological question is, what does meaning want by destroying itself? What does soul want by dissolving every form of authority? to me, it seems like it's really the movement of truth itself that has led to the condition of post-truth. So we have looked through the history of philosophy and through the what do you call it, the cynicism, the critical view, nihilism. We've gone through all these things because truth has been saying, well, isn't it true that words, that the sign and the signifier have no relation? Isn't it true? Whereas before we said, oh, the sign and signifier, we know they're related, they're one thing. Well, at a certain point in modernity, truth itself asks, but look at this. No, these things are not. And we as humans then have to deal with, well, what does that mean? If the sign and the signifier are really separable in that sense, if authority can no longer emerge from any one phenomenon, but is essentially being undermined by one single pursuit of the dissolution of meaning, what is that dissolution trying to achieve? If we look at it from the point of view of soul. If we don't look at it from the point of view of soul, of any number of other disciplines, even many strains of philosophy, we can come up with all kinds of answers, but we will never quite ask that same question. What does soul want from this development? And of course, you know, we may be defeated by that as a question. We may not be able to come up with an answer to it, but to me, at least, Giegerich is saying that is the question that we have to face. Anything else ultimately is a distraction from this singular force that's working its way through consciousness in modernity. The only truth that has true authority now is that there's no truth, that all truth is questionable. No truth can legitimately be put forward without the question is, can that possibly be true? So truth itself is undermined. I read one of the greatest books that I ever read, and it's short and I highly recommend it to anyone, is The Masters of Truth in Archaic Greece by Marcel Détienne. And what he shows is that in pre-axial, pre-Homeric Greece, as really by extension in any mythological culture, truth is what reigns, period. There's no question of, is the king's or the high priest's verdict true or not true? Its success shows that it's true. If the poets keep singing about your greatness is true. If they stop singing about it, it's not a question anymore. So truth in that era, in archaic Greece and in our, you know, quote unquote archaic culture, reigns and has no need to be questioned because it works. And it's only with the Greeks that starts to come apart. And that at Heidegger, you know, said the very questioning begins at that time. Before that, there were no questions, only answers. We knew the first time the eternal ancestors appeared in consciousness chronologically, whatever year that may have been, you know, suddenly there were the eternal ancestors, but they were eternal from the first moment they were imagined. It was just true. It had always been true. From the first moment that anybody thought of it, it had always been true. And with Greece, that's with the Greek philosophy and with the alchemical, if you will, corrosion of thought on this previous unified, what Giegerich calls inness, our inness in mythological thinking, that starts to be dissolved. And so now, having come to this point, this either apex of this revolution or nadir or whatever of this revolution, where we don't know what meaning is. Does it have any meaning? Do we have any meaning? Giegerich wrote an essay, The End of Meaning and the Birth of Man. To me, I would disagree with him, because I would say the end of meaning is the end of man. It's really, we've never existed without our embeddedness in meaning. And now we're in a new phase where that embeddedness is no longer relevant or no longer true. But if we're doing psychology, and only if we're doing psychology, does that meaninglessness, do we think of that meaninglessness as existing within the overall field of meaning, within the pursuit? Soul is inescapable. So soul is doing something with itself by dissolving its own structures of meaning. That would be the only really relevant question at this historical moment to me.
Sustentar a ideia do não sentido, né, de que os sentidos possam ser desfeitos diante de uma teoria do Jung, aonde a questão da verdade, por assim dizer, me parece que está colocada o tempo todo. O self como verdade, o telos como verdade, movimentos compensatórios como a verdade do inconsciente. Como é que a gente consegue conjugar um desabamento dessa noção de verdade e sentido e manter algo da teoria junguiana ainda de pé? É possível? Não sei.
Yeah, absolutely. In an essay called A Little Light to be Carried Through Night and Storm, Giegerich writes about his Jungianism, if you will. And I don't see if I can remember the things that he considers that the Jungian tradition has given that are the things that are worth preserving, or that somehow endure or reemerge through this process. And he mentions, the individuality is one, the soul itself as a notion is another. I can't remember what the third is. But so Giegerich at a certain point simply defends a certain position and says, this is what Jungianism has and can offer, even in this context. So it can consider the question of soul, whereas other approaches cannot or would not. So it's immediately asking a different question than any other discipline would about this process that's taking place. And I think that individually, personal equation again, but that way of looking at things will not have meaning to many, many people. And yet for certain of us, it speaks to something or illuminates something that other approaches don't. And we all have our reasons for being convinced of that, personal reasons, theoretical, logical, intellectual reasons. But if one decides and chooses, yes, I'm going to look at this psychologically, then even if you can't find a sense to that, you're engaging with the question with an eye to the sense. Even if you can't see it, even if you can't discern it, there's still the feeling function at work trying to understand the truth of this phenomenon. I don't know if that answers.
Sim, sim. Acho que é um tema difícil, né, para a gente pensar por várias camadas, mas sim, sim. Michael, queria te fazer a última pergunta.
Deixa eu fazer uma antes, rapidinho.
Claro, claro, Lu, vai.
Eu queria saber mais dessa história de cantar nos 80 anos do Hillman.
I sing classic country music. Hank Williams, Patsy Cline, George Jones, some blues, some bluegrass, some folk music. So I did a couple of songs, and I brought my friend Bill Coleman with me, who is a dancer and a tap dancer. And he showed Hillman how to do the soft shoe by throwing sugar or salt or something on the stage to create that sound. So that was pretty magical. I'm guessing we're kind of coming to the end of our time. Is that right?
Isso. Queria abrir espaço para você falar da House of Shake. Como é que faz alma na House of Shake?
House of Shake was really a childhood vision. I used to drive with my mother past this abandoned house, and I used to say, I want to open History House, which would be a kind of place with dioramas and reenactments. And I was always loved theater, and I was always fascinated by history. And this idea of having a house, having a place that would exist at the crossroads of different worlds, an inn at the crossroads, where somebody from the psychology world might show up, and somebody from this other world, and they would all cross paths there because we shared a certain interest or a certain concerns. Or for me, it's always about meaning. Everything House of Shake does is about meaning in one way or another, and about the crossover nature of meaning. So country music wears its meaning on its sleeve. There's nothing that could be more clear than the feelings that are expressed in country music. But one of the other artists who's involved with House of Shake, Giegerich, is a poet, painter, photographer, works in many media, but he's working on something called the Great Random Generated Text Project. And so that's the other end of meaning, where meaning has lost its meaning in a sense, and he's working with random generated text, and he's writing it out in the tiniest handwriting. He's filling a book with this handwritten text that he's finding online and generating online. So to me, everything about House of Shake, the first book we published, here, I'll do a little promo for it. There's the first book we published. So A Handbook for Ecstatic Survival, which was written by David Earle, who's one of Canada's great choreographers. And so these are from his journals, and it's his reflections on eros and love and music and dance and art. So again, it's that crossover sort of spirit of what do these things mean, and how do they mean, and how do we engage with meaning, and what does meaning mean? On the theoretical level, that's my interest in House of Shake. On the practical level, it's really anything we can produce, conversations we can create that bring people together around those kind of shared meaning, really, the question of shared meaning.
Parabéns. Parabéns pelo projeto.
Thank you, thank you. It's sometimes I wake up and I think, no, I don't want to do any of it. What was I thinking? Like, make it all go away. But then it grabs me again. So.
Michael, obrigado pela tua presença. Foi ótimo te ouvir. Você abriu um leque de questões que são muito complexas. Nós temos aqui no Brasil nos debruçado sobre esses temas e são temas de difícil compreensão, de difícil elaboração. Por isso que falas como essa tua nos ajudam a entender, né? São ferramentas que vêm e clarificam um pouco mais essas ideias tão poderosas, tão intensas, e que nós queremos tanto poder tê-las ao nosso favor. Queria te agradecer pela tua generosidade. Obrigado.
Thank you. Thank you. I will say two little things to end, if I might.
Claro.
One about asking beginners questions. To me, that's the most essential thing you can do, is to take every one of these ideas and go, soul, what's that? What do you mean? I don't get it. To really, Zen mind, beginner's mind. But even more simply, what do we mean when we say soul? Is that different from consciousness? How are we defining all these terms? I think, especially coming and being a layman and an outsider to all this, I have to redefine all these words so that I can use them. And so I am all for always coming back to that beginner's position and going, what are we talking about? What are we talking about? The other thing, where this can go, I think, is something that I've been starting to explore in my writing, and that's the question of nothing is sacred. So if we're in the era where nothing is sacred, what does that mean? It can't simply mean that nothing, from a psychological point of view, it can't simply mean that nothing has any value. And it can't mean that nothing, capital N, should be held sacred, because nothing is sacred. So how can we engage with that notion psychologically? And I think that actually that surprisingly presents possibilities for forward movement. So I would just end on that note.
Muito obrigado, Michael. Foi um enorme prazer te receber. Espero que em breve você possa voltar para a gente poder trocar mais, conversar mais. Vai ser sempre um prazer te ouvir. Obrigado.
Thank you.
Pessoal, obrigado novamente, né? O Michael deixou o site do House of Shake no chat. Ontem eu divulguei também no nosso grupo os textos que o Michael gentilmente nos cedeu, para quem quiser conhecer mais o trabalho do Michael, mais o pensamento dele. Quem não recebeu, entre em contato comigo que eu repasso. E obrigado pela presença, tá bom? Vamos para o próximo encontro, Lu. Quando vai ser?
16 de setembro, só agora.
Com
Murray Stein. Murray Stein.
16 de setembro com Murray Stein. Obrigado. Bom fim de semana. Michael, bom final de semana. Até a próxima.
Thank you so much. Very much appreciated.